Section 10 of The Basis of Morality by Arthur Schopenhauer, translated by Arthur Bullock. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3, Chapter 8. Chapter 8. The Proof Now Given Confirmed by Experience. The truth I have here laid down, that compassion is the sole non-egoistic stimulus, and therefore the only really moral one, is a strange, indeed almost incomprehensible paradox. I shall hope, therefore, to render it less extraordinary to the reader, if I show that it is confirmed by experience and by the universal testimony of human sentiment. 1. For this purpose I shall, in the first place, state an imaginary case, which in the present investigation may serve as an experimentum crucis, a crucial test. But not to make the matter too easy, I shall take no instance of loving kindness, but rather a breach of lawful right, and that of the worst kind. Let us suppose two young people, Gaius and Titus, to be passionately in love, each with a different girl, and that both are completely thwarted by two other men who are preferred because of certain external circumstances. They have both resolved to put their rivals out of the way, and are perfectly secure from every chance of detection, even from all suspicion. But when they come to actually prepare for the murder, each of them, after an inward struggle, draws back. They are now to give us a truthful and clear account of the reasons why they abandoned their project. As for Gaius, I leave it entirely to the reader to choose what motive he likes. It may be that religious grounds checked him, for instance the thought of the divine will, of future retribution, of the judgment to come, etc., or perhaps he may say, quote, I reflected that the principle I was going to apply in this case would not be adapted to provide a rule universally valid for all possible rational beings, because I should have treated my rival only as a means and not at the same time as an end. End quote. Or, following Fichte, he may deliver himself as follows, quote, Every human life is a means towards realizing the moral law. Consequently, I cannot, without being indifferent to this realization, destroy a being ordained to do his part in effecting it. End quote. This scruple, be it observed in passing, he might well overcome by the hope of soon producing a new instrument of the moral law when once in possession of his beloved. Or again, he may speak after the fashion of Wollaston, quote, I considered that such an action would be the expression of a false tenet, end quote. Or like Hutcheson, quote, the moral sense, whose perceptions, equally with those of every other sense, admit of no final explanation, forbade me to commit such a deed, end quote. Or like Adam Smith, quote, I foresaw that my act would awaken no sympathy with me in the minds of the spectators, end quote. Or his language may be borrowed from Christian Wolff, quote, I recognized that I should thereby advance neither the work of making myself perfect, nor the same process in anyone else. End quote. Or from Spinoza, quote, Omni nihil utilius homine, ergo hominem interimere nalui. End quote. To man nothing is more useful than man, therefore I was unwilling to destroy a man. In short, he may say what one pleases, but Titus, whose explanation is supplied by myself, will speak as follows, quote, When I came to make arrangements for the work, and so, for the moment, had to occupy myself not with my own passion, but with my rival, then for the first time I saw clearly what was going to happen to him. But simultaneously I was seized with compassion and pity. Sorrow for him laid hold upon me, and overmastered me. I could not strike the blow. End quote. Now I ask every honest and unprejudiced reader, which of these two is the better man? To which would he prefer to entrust his own destiny? Which is restrained by the purer motive? Consequently, where does the basis of morality lie? 2. There is nothing that revolts our moral sense so much as cruelty. Every other offense we can pardon, but not cruelty. The reason is found in the fact that cruelty is the exact opposite of compassion. When we hear of intensely cruel conduct, as for instance the act which has just been recorded in the papers of a mother who murdered her little son of 5 years by pouring boiling oil into his throat, and her younger child by burying it alive, or what was recently reported from Algiers, how a casual dispute between a Spaniard and an Algerine ended in a fight, and how the latter, having vanquished the other, tore out the whole of his lower jawbone and carried it off as a trophy, leaving his adversary still alive. When we hear of cruelty like this, we are seized with horror, and exclaim, "How is it possible to do such a thing?" Now let me ask what this question signifies. Does it mean, "How is it possible to fear so little the punishments of the future life?" It is difficult to admit this interpretation. Then perhaps it intends to say, "How is it possible to act according to a principle which is so absolutely unfitted to become a general law for all rational beings?" Certainly not. Or, once more, "How is it possible to neglect so utterly one's own perfection as well as that of another?" This is equally unimaginable. The sense of the question is assuredly nothing but this: "How is it possible to be so utterly bereft of compassion?" The conclusion is that when an action is characterized by an extraordinary absence of compassion, it bears the certain stamp of the deepest depravity and loathsomeness. Hence compassion is the true moral incentive. 3. The ethical basis, or the original moral stimulus which I have disclosed, is the only one that can be justly said to have a real and extended sphere of effective influence. No one will surely venture to maintain as much of all the other moral principles that philosophers have set up, for these are composed of abstract, sometimes even of hair-splitting propositions, with no foundation other than an artificial combination of ideas, such that their application to actual conduct would often incline to the comic. A good action, inspired solely by Kant's moral principle, would be at bottom the work of philosophic pedantry, or else would lead the doer into self-deception. Through his reason interpreting conduct, which had other, perhaps nobler, incentives as the product of the categorical imperative, and of the conception of duty which, as we have seen, rests on nothing. But not only is it true that the philosophic moral principles, purely theoretical as they are, have seldom any operative power, of those established by religion and expressly framed for practical purposes, it is equally difficult to predicate any marked efficiency. The chief evidence of this lies in the fact that in spite of the great religious differences in the world, the amount of morality, or rather of immorality, shows no corresponding variation, but in essentials is pretty much the same everywhere. Only it is important not to confound rudeness and refinement with morality and immorality. The religion of Hellas had an exceedingly small moral tendency. It hardly went further than respect for oaths. No dogma was taught, and no system of ethics publicly preached. Nevertheless, all things considered, it does not appear that the Greeks were morally inferior to the men of the Christian era. The morality of Christianity is of a much higher kind than that of any other religion which previously appeared in Europe. But if anyone should believe for this reason that European morals have improved proportionally, and that now at any rate they surpass what obtains elsewhere, it would not be difficult to demonstrate that among the Mohammedans, Nebris, Hindus, and Buddhists there is at least as much honesty, fidelity, toleration, gentleness, beneficence, nobleness, and self-denial as among Christian peoples. Indeed, the scale will be found rather to turn unfavorably for Christendom, when we put into the balance the long list of inhuman cruelties which have constantly been perpetrated within its limits and often in its name. We need only recall for a moment the numerous religious wars, the crusades that nothing can justify, the extirpation of a large part of the American aborigines, and the peopling of that continent by Negroes brought over from Africa without the shadow of a right, torn from their families, their country, their hemisphere, and, as slaves, condemned for life to forced labor. The tireless persecution of heretics, the unspeakable atrocities of the Inquisition that cried aloud to heaven, the massacre of St. Bartholomew, the execution of 18,000 persons in the Netherlands by the Duke of Alva, and these are but a few facts among many. Speaking generally, however, if we compare with the performances of its followers the excellent morality which Christianity and more or less every creed preaches, and then try to imagine how far theory would become practice if crime were not impeded by the secular arm of the state, nay more, what would probably happen if for only one day all laws should be suspended, we shall be obliged to confess that the effect of the various religions on morals is in fact very small. This is of course due to weakness of faith. Theoretically, and so long as it is only a question of piety in the abstract, everyone supposes his belief to be firm enough. Only the searching touchstone of all our convictions is what we do. When the moment for acting arrives, and our faith has to be tested by great self-denial and heavy sacrifices, then its feebleness becomes evident. If a man is seriously planning some evil, he has already broken the bounds of true and pure morality. Thenceforward, the chief restraint that checks him is invariably the dread of justice and the police. Should he be so hopeful of escaping detection as to cast such fears aside, the next barrier that meets him is regard for his honor. If this second rampart be crossed, there is very little likelihood, after both these powerful hindrances are withdrawn, that any religious dogma will appeal to him strongly enough to keep him back from the deed. For if he be not frightened by near and immediate dangers, he will hardly be curbed by terrors which are distant and rest merely on belief. Moreover, there is a positive objection that may be brought against all good conduct proceeding solely from religious conviction. It is not purged of self-interest, but done out of regard for reward and punishment, and hence can have no purely moral value. This view we find very clearly expressed in a letter of the celebrated Grand Duke of Weimar, Karl August. He writes, "Baron Weyers was himself of opinion that he, who is good through religion, and not by natural inclination, must be a bad fellow at heart. In vino veritas." Translation, under the influence of wine one speaks the truth. But now let us turn to the moral incentive which I have disclosed. Who ventures for a moment to deny that it displays a marked and truly wonderful influence at all times, among all peoples, in all circumstances of life, even when constitutional law is suspended, and the horrors of revolutions and wars fill the air, in small things and in great, every day and every hour? Who will refuse to admit that it is constantly preventing much wrong, and calling into existence many a good action, often quite unexpectedly, and where there is no hope of reward? Is there anyone who will gainsay the fact that, where it and it alone has been operative, we all with deep respect and emotion unreservedly recognize the presence of genuine moral worth? 4. Boundless compassion for all living beings is the surest and most certain guarantee of pure moral conduct, and needs no casuistry. Whoever is filled with it will assuredly injure no one, do harm to no one, encroach on no man's rights. He will rather have regard for everyone, forgive everyone, help everyone as far as he can, and all his actions will bear the stamp of justice and loving kindness. On the other hand, if we try to say, "This man is virtuous, but he is a stranger to compassion," or "He is an unjust and malicious man, yet very compassionate," the contradiction at once leaps to light. In former times the English plays used to finish with a petition for the king. The old Indian dramas close with these words, "May all living beings be delivered from pain." Tastes differ, but in my opinion there is no more beautiful prayer than this. 5. Also from separate matters of detail it may be inferred that the original stimulus of true morality is compassion. For instance, to make a man lose 100 thalers, by legal tricks involving no danger, is equally unjust whether he be rich or poor, but in the latter case the rapping of conscience is much louder, the censure of disinterested witnesses more emphatic. Aristotle was well aware of this, and said, "De nateran de estiton atichuda eton etichuda adikin." It is worse to injure a man in adversity than one who is prosperous. If the man have wealth, self-reproach is proportionally faint, and grows still fainter if it be the treasury that has been overreached, for state coffers can form no object of compassion. It thus appears that the grounds for self-accusation, as well as for the spectator's blame, are not furnished directly by the infringement of the law, but chiefly by the suffering thereby brought upon others. The violation of right, by itself and as such, which is involved in cheating the exchequer, to take the above instance, will be disapproved by the conscience alike of actor and witness, but only because, and in so far as, the rule of respecting every right, which forms the sine qua non of all honorable conduct, is in consequence broken. The stricture passed will, in fact, be indirect and limited. If, however, it be a confidential employé in the service that commits the fraud, the case assumes quite another aspect. It then has all the specific attributes of, and belongs to, that class of actions described above, whose characteristic is a double injustice. The analysis here given explains why the worst charge which can ever be brought against rapacious extortioners and legal sharpers is, that they appropriate for themselves the goods of widows and orphans. The reason appears in the fact that the latter, more than others, owing to their helplessness, might be expected to excite compassion in the most callous heart. Hence we conclude that the entire absence of this sense is sufficient to lower a man to the last degree of villainy. 6. Compassion is the root no less of justice than of loving kindness, but it is more clearly evidenced in the latter than in the former. We never receive proofs of genuine loving kindness on the part of others so long as we are in all respects prosperous. The happy man may, no doubt, often hear the words of goodwill on his relations' and friends' lips, but the expression of that pure, disinterested objective participation in the condition and lot of others, which loving kindness begets, is reserved for him who is stricken with some sorrow or suffering, whatever it be. For the fortunate as such we do not feel sympathy unless they have some other claim on us. They remain alien to our hearts. Abent sibi sua. They may keep their own affairs, pleasures, etc. to themselves. Nay, if a man has many advantages over others, he will easily become an object of envy, which is ready, should he once fall from his height of prosperity, to turn into malignant joy. Nevertheless, this menace is, for the most part, not fulfilled. The Sophoclean ielosi dectri, his enemies laugh, does not generally become an actual fact. As soon as the day of ruin comes to one of fortune's spoiled children, there usually takes place a great transformation in the minds of his acquaintances, which for us in this connection is very instructive. In the first place, this change clearly reveals the real nature of the interest that the friends of his happiness took in him. Defugiunt cardis cum faecie sicatis amici. When the casks are drained to the dregs, one's friends run away. On the other hand, the exultation of those who envied his prosperity, the mocking laugh of malicious satisfaction, which he feared more than adversity itself, and the contemplation of which he could not face, are things usually spared him. Jealousy is appeased and disappears with its cause, while compassion which takes its place is the parent of loving kindness. Those who were envious of and hostile to a man in the full tide of success, after his downfall, have not seldom become his friends, ready to protect, comfort, and help. Who has not, at least in a small way, himself experienced something of the sort? Where is the man who, when overtaken by some calamity of whatever nature, has not noticed with surprise how the persons that previously had displayed the greatest coldness, nay, ill will towards him, then came forward with unfeigned sympathy? For misfortune is the condition of compassion, and compassion the source of loving kindness. When our wrath is kindled against a person, nothing quenches it so quickly, even when it is righteous, as the words, "He is an unfortunate man." And the reason is obvious. Compassion is to anger as water to fire. Therefore, whoever would fain have nothing to repent of, let him listen to my advice. When he is inflamed with rage and meditates doing someone a grievous injury, he should bring the thing vividly before his mind, as a fait accompli. He should clearly picture to himself this other fellow being tormented with mental or bodily pain, or struggling with need and misery, so that he is forced to exclaim, "This is my work." Such thoughts as these, if anything, will avail to moderate his wrath. For compassion is the true antidote of anger, and by practicing on oneself this artifice of the imagination, one awakes beforehand while there is yet time. La pitié dont la voix, alors qu'on est vengé, fait entendre ses lois. Translation: Compassion, who with no uncertain tone the work of vengeance done, her laws makes known. And in general, the hatred we may cherish for others is overcome by nothing so easily as by our taking a point of view whence they can appeal to our compassion. The reason indeed why parents, as a rule, specially love the sickly one of their children is because the sight of it perpetually stirs their compassion. 7. There is another proof that the moral incentive disclosed by me is the true one. I mean the fact that animals also are included under its protecting aegis. In the other European systems of ethics no place is found for them, strange and inexcusable as this may appear. It is asserted that beasts have no rights. The illusion is harbored that our conduct, so far as they are concerned, has no moral significance, or, as it is put in the language of these codes, that, quote, there are no duties to be fulfilled towards animals, end quote. Such a view is one of revolting coarseness, a barbarism of the West whose source is Judaism. In philosophy, however, it rests on the assumption, despite all evidence to the contrary, of the radical difference between man and beast, a doctrine which, as is well known, was proclaimed with more trenchant emphasis by Descartes than by anyone else. It was indeed the necessary consequence of his mistakes. When Leibniz and Wolff, following out the Cartesian view, built up out of abstract ideas their rational psychology, and constructed a deathless anima rationalis, rational soul, then the natural claims of the animal kingdom visibly rose up against this exclusive privilege, this human patent of immortality, and nature, as always in such circumstances, entered her silent protest. Our philosophers, owing to the qualms of their intellectual conscience, were soon forced to seek aid for their rational psychology from the empirical method. They accordingly tried to reveal the existence of a vast chasm, an immeasurable gulf between animals and men, in order to represent them, in the teeth of opposing testimony, as existences essentially different. These efforts did not escape the ridicule of Boileau, for we find him saying, quote, Les animaux ont-ils des universités? Voit-on fleurir chez eux des quatre facultés? Translation: Have beasts forsooth their universities, endowed like ours with all four faculties? Such a supposition would end in animals being pronounced incapable of distinguishing themselves from the external world, and of having any self-consciousness, any ego. As answer to such absurd tenets, it would only be necessary to point to the boundless egoism innate in every animal, even the smallest and humblest. This amply proves how perfectly they are conscious of their self, as opposed to the world which lies outside it. If any one of the Cartesian persuasion, with views like these in his head, should find himself in the claws of a tiger, he would be taught in the most forcible manner what a sharp distinction such a beast draws between his ego and the non-ego. Corresponding to these philosophical fallacies, we notice a peculiar sophism in the speech of many peoples, especially the Germans. For the commonest matters connected with the processes of life, for food, drink, conception, the bringing forth of young, for death and the dead body, such languages have special words applicable only to animals, not to men. In this way the necessity of using the same terms for both is avoided, and the perfect identity of the thing concealed under verbal differences. Now, since the ancient tongues show no trace of such a dual mode of expression, but frankly denote the same things by the same words, it follows that this miserable artifice is beyond all doubt the work of European priestcraft, which, in its profanity, knows no limit to its disavowal of and blasphemy against the eternal reality that lives in every animal. Thus was laid the foundation of that harshness and cruelty towards beasts which is customary in Europe, and on which a native of the Asiatic uplands could not look without righteous horror. In English this infamous invention is not to be found, assuredly because the Saxons, when they conquered England, were not yet Christians. Nevertheless, the English language shows something analogous in the strange fact that it makes all animals of the neuter gender, the pronoun it being employed for them, just as if they were lifeless things. This idiom has a very objectionable sound, especially in the case of dogs, monkeys, and other primates, and is unmistakably a priestly trick, designed to reduce beasts to the level of inanimate objects. The ancient Egyptians, who dedicated all their days to religion, were accustomed to place in the same vault with a human mummy that of an ibis, a crocodile, etc. In Europe it is a crime, an abomination to bury a faithful dog beside the resting place of his master, though it is there perhaps that he, with a fidelity and attachment unknown to the sons of men, awaited his own end. To a recognition of the identity, in all essentials, of the phenomena which we call man and beast, nothing leads more surely than the study of zoology and anatomy. What shall we say then, when in these days, 1839, a canting dissector has been found, who presumes to insist on an absolute and radical difference between human beings and animals, and who goes so far as to attack and calumniate honest zoologists that keep aloof from all priestly guile, eye service, and hypocrisy, and dare to follow the leading of nature and of truth? Those persons must indeed be totally blind, or else completely chloroformed by the foetor judaicus, Jewish stench, who do not discern that the truly essential and fundamental part in man and beast is identically the same thing. That which distinguishes the one from the other does not lie in the primary and original principle, in the inner nature, in the kernel of the two phenomena, this kernel being in both alike the will of the individual. It is found in what is secondary, in the intellect, in the degree of perceptive capacity. It is true that the latter is incomparably higher in man by reason of his added faculty of abstract knowledge, called reason. Nevertheless, this superiority is traceable solely to a greater cerebral development, in other words, to the corporeal difference, which is quantitative, not qualitative, of a single part, the brain. In all other respects, the similarity between men and animals, both psychical and bodily, is sufficiently striking, so that we must remind our Judaized friends in the West, who despise animals and idolize reason, that if they were suckled by their mothers, so also was the dog by his. Even Kant fell into this common mistake of his age and of his country, and I have already administered the censure which it is impossible to withhold. The fact that Christian morality takes no thought for beasts is a defect in the system which is better admitted than perpetuated. One's astonishment is, however, all the greater, because, with this exception, it shows the closest agreement with the ethics of Brahmanism and Buddhism, being only less strongly expressed and not carried to the last consequences imposed by logic. On the whole, there seems little room for doubting that, in common with the idea of a god become man, or avatar, it has an Asiatic origin and probably came to Judea by way of Egypt, so that Christianity would be a secondary reflection of the primordial light that shone in India, which, falling first on Egypt, was unhappily refracted from its ruins upon Jewish soil. An apt symbol of the insensibility of Christian ethics to animals, while in other points its similarity to the Indian is so great, may be found in the circumstance that John the Baptist comes before us in all respects like a Hindu sannyasin, except that he is clothed in skins, a thing which would be, as is well known, an abomination in the eyes of every follower of Brahmanism or Buddhism. The Royal Society of Calcutta only received their copy of the Vedas on their distinctly promising that they would not have it bound in leather, after European fashion. In silken binding, therefore, it is now to be seen on the shelves of their library. Again, the gospel story of Peter's draught of fishes, which the Saviour blesses so signally that the boats are overladen and begin to sink, forms a characteristic contrast to what is related of Pythagoras. It is said that the latter, initiated as he was in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, bought the draught from the fishermen, while the net was still under water, in order to at once set at liberty the captive denizens of the sea. Compassion for animals is intimately connected with goodness of character, and it may be confidently asserted that he who is cruel to living creatures cannot be a good man. Moreover, this compassion manifestly flows from the same source whence arise the virtues of justice and loving kindness towards men. Thus, for instance, people of delicate sensitiveness, on realizing that in a fit of ill humor or anger or under the influence of wine they punished their dog, their horse, their ape undeservedly, or unnecessarily or excessively, are seized with the same remorse, feel the same dissatisfaction with themselves, as when they are conscious of having done some wrong to one of their fellows. The only difference, a purely nominal one, is that in the latter case this remorse, this dissatisfaction, is called the voice of conscience rising in rebuke. I remember having read of an Englishman who, when hunting in India, had killed a monkey, that he could not forget the dying look which the creature cast on him, so that he never fired at these animals again. Another sportsman, William Harris by name, a true Nimrod, has much the same story to tell. During the years 1836–7, he traveled far into the heart of Africa, merely to indulge his passion for the chase. A passage in his book, published at Bombay in 1838, describes how he shot his first elephant, a female. Next morning, on going to look for his game, he found that all the elephants had fled from the neighborhood, except a young one, which had spent the night beside its dead mother. Seeing the huntsmen, it forgot all fear and came to meet them with the clearest and most lively signs of disconsolate grief, and put its tiny trunk about them as if to beg for help. "Then," says Harris, "I was filled with real remorse for what I had done, and felt as if I had committed a murder." The English nation, with its fine sensibility, is, in fact, distinguished above all others for extraordinary compassion towards animals, which appears at every opportunity, and is so strong that, despite the cold superstition which otherwise degrades them, these Anglo-Saxons have been led through its operation to fill up by legislation the lacuna that their religion leaves in morality. For this gap is precisely the reason why in Europe and America there is need of societies for the protection of animals, which are entirely dependent on the law for their efficiency. In Asia, the religions themselves suffice, consequently no one there ever thinks of such associations. Meanwhile, Europeans are awakening more and more to a sense that beasts have rights, in proportion as the strange notion is being gradually overcome and outgrown that the animal kingdom came into existence solely for the benefit and pleasure of man. This view, with the corollary that non-human living creatures are to be regarded merely as things, is at the root of the rough and altogether reckless treatment of them which obtains in the West. To the honor, then, of the English be it said that they are the first people who have, in downright earnest, extended the protecting arm of the law to animals. In England, the miscreant that commits an outrage on beasts has to pay for it, equally whether they are his own or not. Nor is this all. There exists in London the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, a corporate body voluntarily formed, which, without state assistance and at great cost, is of no small service in lessening the tale of tortures inflicted on animals. Its emissaries are ubiquitous, and keep secret watch in order to inform against the tormentors of dumb, sensitive creatures, and such persons have therefore good reason to stand in fear of them. At all the steep bridges in London this society stations a pair of horses, which without any charge is attached to heavy freight wagons. Is not this admirable? Does it not elicit our approval, as unfailingly as any beneficent action towards men? Also, the Philanthropic Society of London has done its part. In 1837 it offered a prize of £30 for the best exposition of the moral reasons which exist to keep men from torturing animals. The line of argument, however, had to be taken almost exclusively from Christianity, whereby the difficulty of the task was, of course, increased. But 2 years later, in 1839, Mr. McNamara was the successful competitor. At Philadelphia there is an Animals Friends Society, having the same aims, and it is to the president of the latter that a book called Philozoia, or Moral Reflections on the Actual Condition of Animals and the Means of Improving the Same, has been dedicated by its author, T. Forster. It is original and well written. Mr. Forster earnestly commends to his readers the humane treatment of animals. As an Englishman, he naturally tries to strengthen his position by the support of the Bible, but he is on slippery ground, and meets with such poor success that he ends by catching at the following ingenious position. Jesus Christ, he says, was born in a stable among oxen and asses, which was meant to indicate symbolically that we ought to regard the beasts as our brothers and treat them accordingly. All that I have here adduced sufficiently proves that the moral chord of which we are speaking is now at length beginning to vibrate also in the West. For the rest, we may observe that compassion for sentient beings is not to carry us to the length of abstaining from flesh like the Brahmins. This is because, by a natural law, capacity for pain keeps pace with the intelligence. Consequently, men, by going without animal food, especially in the north, would suffer more than beasts do through a quick death, which is always unforeseen, although the latter ought to be made still easier by means of chloroform. Indeed, without meat nourishment, mankind would be quite unable to withstand the rigors of the northern climate. The same reasoning explains, too, why we are right in making animals work for us. It is only when they are subjected to an excessive amount of toil that cruelty begins. 8. It is perhaps not impossible to investigate and explain metaphysically the ultimate cause of that compassion in which alone all non-egoistic conduct can have its source. But let us for the moment put aside such inquiries and consider the phenomenon in question from the empirical point of view, simply as a natural arrangement. Now, if nature's intention was to soften as much as possible the numberless sufferings of every sort to which our life is exposed and which no one altogether escapes, if she wished to provide some counterbalance for the burning egoism which fills all beings and often develops into malice, it will at once strike everyone as obvious that she could not have chosen any method more effectual than that of planting in the human heart the wonderful disposition which inclines one man to share the pain of another, and from which proceeds the voice that bids us, in tones strong and unmistakable, take thought for our neighbor, calling at one time protect, at another help. Assuredly, from the mutual succor thus arising, there was more to be hoped for towards the attainment of universal well-being than from a stern command of duty, couched in general abstract terms, the product of certain reasoning processes and of artificial combinations of conceptions. From such an imperative, indeed, all the less result could be expected, because to the rough human unit general propositions and abstract truths are unintelligible, the concrete only having some meaning for him. And it should be remembered that mankind in its entirety, a very small part alone excepted, has always been rude, and must remain so, since the large amount of bodily toil, which for the race as a whole is inevitable, leaves no time for mental culture, whereas, in order to awaken that sense which has been proved to be the sole source of disinterested action and consequently the true basis of morals, there is no need of abstract knowledge, but only of intuitive perception, of the simple comprehension of a concrete case. To this compassion is at once responsive without the mediation of other thoughts. 9. The following circumstance will be found in complete accord with the last paragraph. The foundation which I have given to ethics leaves me without a forerunner among the school philosophers. Indeed, my position is paradoxical as far as their teaching goes, and many of them, for instance the Stoics, Spinoza, and Kant, only notice the motive of compassion to utterly reject and condemn it. On the other hand, my basis is supported by the authority of the greatest moralist of modern times, for such undoubtedly J.J. Rousseau is, that profound reader of the human heart, who drew his wisdom not from books but from life, and intended his doctrine not for the professorial chair but for humanity. He, the foe of all prejudice, the foster child of nature, whom alone she endowed with the gift of being able to moralize without tediousness, because he hit the truth and stirred the heart. I shall therefore venture here to cite some passages from his works in support of my theory, observing that, so far, I have been as sparing as possible with regard to quotations. In the Discours sur l'origine de l'inégalité, page 91, he says, Il y a un autre principe que Hobbes n'a point aperçu et qui ayant été donné à l'homme pour adoucir en certaines circonstances la férocité de son amour-propre, tempère la douleur qui a pour son bien-être par une répugnance innée à voir souffrir son semblable. Je ne crois pas avoir aucune contradiction à craindre en accordant à l'homme la seule vertu naturelle, qui a été forcé de reconnaître les détracteurs les plus outrés des vertus humaines. Je parle de la pitié, etc. Translation: There is another principle which Hobbes did not perceive at all. It was implanted in man in order to soften, in certain circumstances, the fierceness of his self-love, and it moderates the ardor which he feels for his own well-being by producing a certain innate aversion to the sight of a fellow creature's suffering. In attributing to man the only natural virtue, which even the most advanced skepticism has been forced to recognize, I stand assuredly in no fear of any contradiction. I allude to compassion, etc. Page 92. Mondeville a bien senti qu'avec toute leur morale les hommes ne sont jamais été que des monstres, si la nature ne leur ait donné la pitié à l'appui de la raison. Mais il n'a pas vu que de cette surqualité découlant toutes les vertus sociales qui vous disputez aux hommes. En effet, qu'est-ce que la générosité, la clémence, l'humanité, sinon la pitié, appliquée aux faibles, aux coupables, ou à l'espèce humaine en général? La bienveillance et l'amitié même sont, à la bien prendre, des productions d'une pitié constante, fixée sur un objet particulier, car désirer que quelqu'un ne souffre point, qu'est autre chose que désirer qu'il soit heureux. La commisération sera d'autant plus énergique que l'animal spectateur s'identifiera plus intimement avec l'animal souffrant. Translation: Mandeville was right in thinking that with all their systems of morality, men would never have been anything but monsters if nature had not given them compassion to support their reason. But he failed to see that from this one quality spring all the social virtues, which he was unwilling to credit mankind with. In reality, what is generosity, clemency, humanity, if not compassion, applied to the weak, to the guilty, or to the human race as a whole? Even benevolence and friendship, if we look at the matter rightly, are seen to result from a constant compassion directed upon a particular object, for to desire that someone should not suffer is nothing else than to desire that he should be happy. The more closely the living spectator identifies himself with the living sufferer, the more active does pity become. Page 94. Il est donc bien certain que la pitié est un sentiment naturel qui, modérant en chaque individu l'amour de soi-même, concourt à la conversation mutuelle de toute l'espèce. C'est elle qui, dans l'état de nature, tient lieu des lois, des mœurs et des vertus avec cet avantage, que nul ne sera tenté de désobéir à sa douce voix. C'est elle qui détournera tout sauvage robuste d'enlever à un faible enfant ou à un vieillard infirme sa subsistance acquise avec peine. Si lui-même espère pouvoir trouver la sienne ailleurs, c'est elle qui, au lieu de cette maxime sublime de justice raisonnée, fais à autrui comme tu veux qu'on te fasse, inspire à tous les hommes cette autre maxime de bonté naturelle, bien moins parfaite, mais plus utile peut-être que le précédent. Fais ton bien avec le monde d'autrui qui est possible. C'est un mot dans ce sentiment naturel plutôt que dans les arguments subtils qu'il faut chercher la cause de la répugnance que prouverait tout homme à mal faire, même indépendamment des maximes de l'éducation. Translation: It is, then, quite certain that compassion is a natural feeling, which, checking, as it does, the love of self in each individual, helps by a reciprocal process to preserve the whole race. This it is, which, in the state of nature, takes the place of laws, customs, and virtues, with the added advantage that no one will be tempted to disobey its gentle voice. This it is, which will restrain every able-bodied savage, provided he hope to find his own livelihood elsewhere, from robbing a weak child, or depriving an infirm old man of the subsistence won by hard toil. This it is, which inspires all men, not indeed with that sublime maxim of reasoned justice, "Do to others as you would they should do unto you," but with another rule of natural goodness, no doubt less perfect, but perhaps more useful, namely, "Do what is good for yourself with the least possible harm to others." In a word, it is in this natural feeling rather than in subtle arguments that we must look for the reason of the repugnance with which every one is accustomed to view bad conduct, quite independently of the principles laid down by education. End translation. Let this be compared with what he says in Émile, Book 4, pages 115 to 120, where the following passage occurs among others. En effet, comme nous les hommes émouvoir à la pitié, si ce n'est en nous transportant hors de nous et en nous identifiant avec l'animal souffrant, en quittant, pour ainsi dire, notre être pour prendre le sien. Nous ne souffrons qu'autant que nous jugions qu'il souffrait. Ce n'est pas dans nous, c'est dans lui que nous souffrons. Offrir au jeune homme des objets sur lesquels puisse agir la force expansive de son cœur, qui les dilatant, qui l'entendant sur les autres êtres, qui les faisant partout se retrouver hors de lui, écarter avec son cœur, qui les resserrant, les concentrer, et tendant les réseaux du moi au moi, etc. Translation: In fact, how is it that we let ourselves be moved to pity, if not by getting out of our own consciousness and becoming identified with the living sufferer, by leaving, so to say, our own being and entering into his? We do not suffer, except as we suppose he suffers. It is not in us, it is in him, that we suffer. Offer a young man objects on which the expansive force of his heart can act, objects such as may enlarge his nature, and incline it to go out to other beings, in whom he may everywhere find himself again. Keep carefully away those things which narrow his view and make him self-centered, and which tighten the strings of the human ego. End translation. Inside the pale of the schools, as above remarked, there is not a single authority in favor of my position, but outside I have other testimony to cite in addition to Rousseau's. The Chinese admit 5 cardinal virtues, Chang, of which the chief is compassion, Xin. The other 4 are justice, courtesy, wisdom, and sincerity. Similarly, among the Hindus, we find that on the tablets placed to the memory of dead chieftains, compassion for men and animals takes the first place in the record of their virtues. At Athens there was an altar to compassion in the agora, as we know from Pausanias 1:17. Athines deenti agora esti eleo vomos, o malistatheon es anthropinon veon ke metavolas pragmaton oti otelimos, monitimas alinon nemusin Athene. Translation: The Athenians have an altar in their agora to compassion, for this deity, they believe, is of all the gods the most helpful in human life and its vicissitudes. They are the only Greeks who have instituted this cultus. Lucian also mentions this altar in the Timon subsection 99. A phrase of Phocion, preserved by Stobaeus, describes compassion as the most sacred thing in human life. Ute exiron voman, ute ectis anthropis physios affereteon ton erion. Translation: A temple must not be despoiled of its altar, nor human nature of compassion. In the Sapientia Indorum, the Greek translation of the Panchatantra, we read, De gettegar os protiton areton e elimosini. Translation: The chief of virtues is said to be compassion. It is clear, then, that the real source of morality has been distinctly recognized at all times and in all countries, Europe alone excepted, owing to the foetor judaicus, Jewish stench, which here pervades everything, and is the reason why the Western races require for the object of their obedience a command of duty, a moral law, an imperative, in short, an order and decree. They remain wedded to this habit of thought, and refuse to open their eyes to the fact that such a view is, after all, based upon nothing but egoism. Of course, now and then, isolated individuals of fine perception have felt the truth and given it utterance. Such a one was Rousseau, and such Lessing. In a letter written by the latter in 1756 we read, quote, "The best man, and the one most likely to excel in all social virtues, in all forms of magnanimity, is he who is most compassionate." End of section 10.